There is a question gratting in plain sight inside Warhammer 40,000 lore, and most people walk right past it without ever stopping to ask it. It sits in the middle of 10,000 years of documented history, wrapped in prophecy and ash, and the quiet convictions of green-armored warriors who have refused for a very long time to accept the word dead as a permanent answer to anything. Everyone in this hobby knows about Reboot Guilliman. He woke from a 10,000-year-long near-death experience in a stasis coffin, opened his eyes, took one long look at the Imperium his successors had managed to build in his absence, and reportedly delivered something very politely devastating in response before immediately setting about reorganizing everything. His return broke the entire setting wide open. The Gathering Storm arc, the Era Indomitus, the Primaris Space Marines, all of it flows directly from the moment Guilliman sat up in that coffin and decided that somebody had to start being competent around here. And it might as well be him. Billions of words have been written about it, dozens of supplements produced. The hobby world reoriented itself around this one event in ways that are still unfolding right now. People know about the Lion. Lionel Johnson, the first of the Primarchs, the most ancient of the surviving loyalists, who slept for 10,000 years in the depths of the rock, the great fortress asteroid of his chapter, tended in that long sleep by mysterious figures called the Watchers in the Dark. He woke up in recent canon, stiff and furious, and carrying the particular energy of a man who has 10,000 years of unfinished business and an extremely complicated relationship with the concept of transparency. His sons have always kept secrets. Their father is back now, keeping secrets more efficiently than any of them ever managed. People know about Magnus the Red, the Crimson King, who sits atop his fractured crystal tower on the planet of sorcerers, with a mind capable of perceiving the future's rough shape, and a spirit drowning in 10,000 years of bittersweet regret about the gap between his intentions, their consequences. They know about Mortarion, his plague fleets spreading Nurgle's particular brand of loving rot through system after system, converting the living into something that chaos considers an improvement. They know about Fulgrim, who traded everything beautiful about himself for a version of perfection that turned out to be beautiful only in the sense that a perfectly made knife is beautiful, which is to say functional and cold and useful for exactly one thing. But there is another name, and this name comes up differently from all the others, not with the reverence that Guilliman's return commands, not with the weight of tragedy that attends discussions of Sanguinius, whose death at the Siege of Terra is one of the setting's most devastating and most mourned moments. Not with the romantic melancholy surrounding Leman Russ, who disappeared into the Eye of Terror with a prophecy and a promise. Not even with the comfortable, settled grief that defines the dead Primarchs, those whose fates were determined in blood long before the current era. This name gets spoken with something rarer and stranger than all of those. It gets spoken with calm, unshakable, present-tense certainty. Vulcan lives. Not lived, not may have lived, not we hope he lives, somewhere, somehow. Vulcan lives, right now, in the present tense, in the war cries that echo off obsidian walls and volcanic stone, in the stamp of armored boots on the parade grounds of Prometheus, in the quiet words that salamanders say to each other before they go into battle. It is not a hope. It is not a comfort. It is a statement of fact that 10,000 years of salamanders have maintained with the bedrock conviction of people who have looked at the evidence and arrived at a conclusion that they are simply not willing to revisit. And here is the thing that this video is going to spend considerable time establishing. They are almost certainly right. Of all 20 of the Primarchs created in the Emperor's laboratories beneath the Himalayan peaks, of all the demigods scattered across the galaxy and raised by whatever worlds happen to receive them, Vulcan is perhaps the single most logically and lore-supportedly likely to be alive in the current era of the 41st millennium. Not Guilliman, who is confirmed active and spending his days doing things like organizing supply chains and fighting chaos fleets and being diplomatically disappointed in everyone around him. Not the Lion, who is confirmed awake and wandering the galaxy with his characteristic approach to honesty, which is to say minimally Vulcan, who is listed in Imperial records as presumed dead, who disappeared in an explosion on an orc world in the 32nd millennium, whose chapter spent the following 900 years and more ignoring that determination with remarkable consistency and continuing to search for the conditions of his prophesied return. There is a reason for that certainty, and it goes much deeper than loyalty or love or the psychological need to believe your father is coming back. It is grounded in something specific about Vulcan's biology that makes the standard rules about death simply not applicable to him in the same way they are applicable to everything else. It involves a concept called a perpetual, which is one of the most quietly extraordinary ideas in all of Warhammer lore. And understanding what that concept actually means is the foundation of understanding why the salamanders are correct. So let us begin at the beginning. Let us trace this Primarch from his very first moment, from the volcanic plains of Nocturne and the forge fire of a blacksmith who found a baby in a capsule and chose to raise him without asking too many questions, all the way through the Great Crusade, through the catastrophe of the drop site massacre and the months of unimaginable torment that followed it, through his resurrection and his long, difficult journey home to Terra, through the silence that swallowed him in the years after the heresy, through his return during the War of the Beast, and then through the explosion on Olenor that ended his last confirmed appearance in any historical record. And then let us look at what the evidence actually says about what comes after that. Not what the Imperium officially believes, not what feels emotionally satisfying as a narrative conclusion, what the biology implies, what the prophecy states, what 10,000 years of active, ongoing, resource-intensive searching by the salamanders points toward. Let us answer the question that the setting has been building toward since the first time someone wrote those two words next to each other with a full stop instead of a question mark. Vulcan lives. Before we go any further, if you're here and already feeling drawn in, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell me where in the world you are watching from and what time it is there. I genuinely love knowing who is out here in the quiet, digging into this lore alongside me late at night or early in the morning or whenever you find the time. And if you haven't subscribed yet, this is a good moment for that. There is a great deal more of this story to tell, and I am not going anywhere. Section 2. Born in Fire, Nocturne, and the Child Who Refused to Hide. To understand Vulcan, you have to understand Nocturne first, because Nocturne is not simply the setting of his origin story. It is the environment that built him, that shaped every value he held, and every reflex he carried into battle, and every principle he eventually encoded into the culture of his legion. The planet is not background. It is character. Nocturne sits in a binary star system, and its relationship with its oversized moon, Prometheus, creates a gravitational dynamic that any responsible planetary geologist would describe as alarming. The surface is dominated by volcanic mountain ranges of extraordinary scale, not the dormant or gently active formations that temperate worlds treat as scenic features, but genuinely fierce and ongoing geological processes contributing to the constant reshaping of the planet in real time. The ground beneath Nocturne is in motion. The magma chambers honeycombing the planetary crust are vast, and the rock above them is thin enough in places that the concept of stable ground requires a certain amount of optimism to maintain. The air carries sulfur. The soil, in the stretches between lava fields and obsidian plains, is rich in volcanic minerals that produce some of the most valuable and unusual resources in that region of the galaxy. This mineral wealth is the reason human beings colonized Nocturne during the dark age of technology, making the pragmatic calculation that the resources justified the environment. The sky is frequently dark, with ash and volcanic particulate, and the horizons are often lit at night, not by stars, but by the amber and orange glow of active lava flows painting the distant peaks. Every 15 standard years, this already difficult situation escalates into something categorically worse. The orbital mechanics of the Nocturne Prometheus system produce a convergence point, a moment when the gravitational forces generated by the two bodies' proximity trigger a cascade of geological events across the surface simultaneously. This is called the time of trials, and it is comprehensive in exactly the way the name suggests. Tidal waves tear apart the coastal settlements. Earthquakes shatter the inland ones. Volcanic eruptions that have been building pressure for the entire 15-year cycle finally release, and these eruptions are not modest events. The landscape that existed before a time of trials does not exist afterward, not damaged, remade. The lava flows cover what the earthquakes spare, and when they cool, the planet has different mountains, different plains, different terrain features from the ones the people living there had spent 15 years knowing. And then the survivors rebuild. This is the part that matters for understanding the culture Vulcan was raised in. The Nocturnians did not have a choice about rebuilding. The only options the planet offered were survive and rebuild, or die, and the people who had been living there for generations had been selected by that binary, down to the ones who could genuinely endure catastrophe and come out the other side still capable of starting again. The culture that emerged from this was one that treated endurance as the foundational virtue from which all others derived, because without endurance, nothing else was possible, and with it, everything else was eventually achievable. But there was another nightmare running parallel to the geological ones, and this one came with deliberate intent. The Dark Eldar, specifically the Mandrakes, a particular variety of Dark Eldar whose shadow realm of Aelendrak was connected to Nocturne through ancient webway portals in the planet's volcanic subsurface, used Nocturne as a regular hunting ground. The portals gave them reliable, repeatable access to the surface, which the Mandrakes applied in the way that Dark Eldar apply any advantage they possess, which is with focused, strategic, creative cruelty. They came through the portals without warning, and they took people. Men, women, children, without distinction, carried back through the portals into Comora's nightmare architecture for purposes that were reliably terrible. The Nocturnians could not effectively fight them. The technological and physiological gap was too large, and the raid parties were organized with the specific expertise of people who had been doing this for centuries and had refined the approach to remove as much uncertainty as possible. The webway access meant they could appear at the point of maximum vulnerability by design. Against this kind of opponent, any individual defense was futile, and attempting organized military response against enemies who could vanish back through their portals at the moment conditions turned unfavorable was a strategic dead end. So the Nocturnians, across many generations, developed the only viable response available. They hid, carefully, systematically, with the same craftsman's attention to detail they brought to everything else. Every family had its hiding place. Every settlement had its agreed routes of retreat, its signals for dispersal, its underground chambers and concealed corners that had kept people alive before and might again. This was not cowardice, and it was not weakness. It was the mathematics of survival applied honestly to an impossible situation. You do not fight what you cannot defeat. You wait for it to pass over you, and you count your losses, and you rebuild, and you try to make the numbers work out slightly better next time. This was the world into which a capsule fell from the sky, sometime around the year 832 of the 30th millennium. The people who witnessed it coming down described a pillar of fire dropping from the volcanic sky during a time of trial, which, given the existing ambient chaos of erupting mountains and ash-darkened air, meant it blended into its surroundings better than it might have on a calmer world. But the impact was unmistakable. Something had come down hard and fast, and when the smoke cleared, there was a crater and wreckage of a technological artifact beyond anything the Iron Age culture of Nocturne had words for. And in the center of it, a baby. A blacksmith named Enbel found the child. Enbel was, by all accounts that survive from this period, a man of considerable practical skill and relatively uncomplicated priorities. He worked metal, he raised his family, he endured the times of trial, and rebuilt when they passed, as all Nocturnians did. He found a baby in an impact crater, surrounded by alien technology he had no way to understand, and he took the baby home, and he gave it a name, and he raised it as his son. The name was Vulcan. The child grew, and he kept growing, and in the way that growth rarely but sometimes works, he grew into something that made everyone around him recalibrate their understanding of what was possible for a person to be. By the time Vulcan was old enough to be genuinely useful in the smithy, it was already clear that the rules governing human development did not fully apply to him. He was enormous, not just tall, but physically dense in a way that normal growth patterns simply don't produce. The kind of size and structural solidity that implied his body was operating on different specifications. His skin, dark like the Nocturnian populations, but with a quality that the heat of the forge only confirmed, was resistant to fire damage at a level that started conversations he didn't know how to finish yet. He could work bare-handed at temperatures that would scar anyone else without flinching. He could reach into a forge fire and retrieve cooling metal without protective equipment, because his hands simply didn't respond to heat the way hands were supposed to. He absorbed Nimbel's craft with a speed that went past aptitude into something that felt more like recognition, as if the principles of smithing were things he was remembering from somewhere deep and familiar, rather than learning fresh. Within a few years, he was producing work that exceeded anything Nimbel could make alone, not because he had surpassed the technique, but because he added something to it that Nimbel hadn't possessed, which was an artist's instinct for what a thing should be, in addition to what it needed to do. A blade Vulcan made wasn't just sharp, it was right, in a holistic sense that was difficult to articulate but immediately felt when you held it. A tool wasn't just functional, it had a balance, and a finish, and a quality of attention in its making that made it something more than its purpose alone. He was also, and this deserves emphasis because it is genuinely remarkable in the context of what he would eventually become, deeply and actively kind. Not in a passive, quiet way, but in a present, engaged, noticing way that was unusual enough in the hard world of Nocturne that people talked about it. He learned people's names and remembered the circumstances attached to those names in the way that attentive people do, returning weeks or months later with questions that showed he'd been carrying specific details around. He made things for families who couldn't pay for them, not secretly, but openly, because the families needed the things and the payment felt beside the point when the need was that clear. He noticed when people were struggling and addressed it directly, rather than allowing social convention to prevent him from acknowledging what was obvious. Nocturne had not burned this out of him. The times of trial and the Dark Eldar raids, and the grinding difficulty of daily life on a planet that seemed designed to resist human comfort, had produced in Vulcan the opposite of what they produced in people who broke under them. They had distilled him into someone very clear about what mattered. Then the Dark Eldar came again, in Vulcan's 4th year on Nocturne by Nimbel's count, and everything changed. The warning arrived in the usual way, distant sounds that the Nocturnians had trained themselves to recognize before they fully resolved into the specific horror they announced. The village dispersed along its practiced routes. Families moved to their hiding places with the particular efficiency of people who have rehearsed something enough times that the rehearsal has replaced thought in the moment of performance. Doors were pulled shut, children were silenced, and Vulcan stood in the center of the settlement with a smithing hammer in each hand, crossed over his shoulders, and waited. He had made a decision that was simultaneously simple and radical, in the way that the most important decisions usually are. The mathematics of continued hiding didn't work. Every successful raid proved to the Dark Eldar that this location was accessible and undefended and worth returning to. The only way to change the outcome in any durable sense was to change one of the conditions producing it, and the condition he could most directly affect was the undefended part. So he stood in the open and waited for the Dark Eldar to notice him, and when they did, he showed them what he was. He killed them in numbers that should have been beyond a single person, even a person with his physical gifts, because his physical gifts were extraordinary, and his instinct for combat was something that had apparently been waiting in him all along for an occasion that required it. The rest of the settlement, watching from their hiding places, as this person who fixed their tools and remembered their names and made things for their families for free, stood in the open against the people who had been taking their neighbors for generations, did the only thing that made emotional sense in that moment. They came out of their hiding places and joined him. It was not a rational, tactical decision. It was the response of people who had watched someone they trusted make an impossible thing look possible by simply doing it, and who could not remain in their hiding places while that was happening. Vulcan had not asked them to come out. He had not made a speech or articulated an argument. He had stood in the open with 2 hammers, and his refusal to hide, and demonstrated that the situation, which had seemed absolutely fixed and permanent and unchangeable, could be changed by someone willing to stand rather than conceal themselves. Within weeks, every settlement leader of consequence on Nocturne had traveled to meet him. They swore, in the terms that Nocturnian culture treated as binding in the deepest way, such things could be binding, that they would never hide from the Dark Eldar again, that they would stand and defend their homes. Not because the odds had changed dramatically in their favor, because they hadn't. The Dark Eldar were still more capable and better equipped and operating from the tactical advantage of webway access. But the decision to stop hiding was a decision about identity, about what kind of people the Nocturnians were going to be, and that decision, once made with genuine commitment by enough people, changed the character of every subsequent encounter. What Vulcan had done was change the story. The Nocturnians had been living inside a story about themselves as people who survived by hiding, who managed their losses, and endured what they couldn't prevent. Vulcan replaced that story with one about people who survived by standing, by choosing the harder thing, by refusing to let the shape of the situation dictate the shape of their response. And from that replacement, that single shift in collective self-understanding, grew everything else about the culture he would eventually build into a legion and send across the galaxy. He spent the years after that becoming, without ever declaring himself anything in particular, the person that Nocturne organized itself around. He settled disputes with a fairness that was grounded in genuine attention to the specific people and circumstances involved, rather than the application of abstract rules. He led defenses with a tactical sense that improved rapidly with experience. He trained people who wanted to learn to fight, because he understood that his own presence would not always be sufficient, and that the capacity to defend oneself needed to be distributed, not concentrated in a single, extraordinary individual. He worked the forge. He built things. He walked through communities, and talked to people, and carried their concerns with him into the planning he did for their benefit. And then, a pale stranger arrived at a tournament organized to celebrate the Dark Eldar victory, wearing clothes made of materials that didn't exist in Nocturne's Iron Age civilization, and he asked to compete, and everything that Vulcan had spent years becoming turned out to have been preparation for the thing that was about to begin. Section 3. The Emperor's Contest and the Forging of a Legion. The tournament was organized to mark the moment when Nocturne decided to stop hiding, which made it a celebration of a cultural identity shift as much as a military victory. The Nocturnians knew how to honor the things that deserved honoring, and this deserved it. The events reflected what they valued: strength, endurance, and above all, craftsmanship, because on a world that rebuilt itself after every catastrophe through the skilled hands of its people, the ability to make things well was not merely economic. It was the proof of who you were. The stranger appeared at the opening ceremonies. He was pale against the dark complexions of the Nocturnian population, which made him conspicuous, and his clothes were wrong in ways that had no reference points in the material culture available on Nocturne's surface. Strange fabrics, strange construction, things that implied a world and a level of production that shouldn't have existed within his apparent reach. He asked to participate. He said he could best any man at the competitions. The crowd found this entertaining, because the competitions were taking place specifically to honor the man who had just driven back the Dark Eldar nearly single-handedly and was currently standing nearby, looking exactly as formidable as someone who had done that would look. The stranger wagered terms as old as competition itself. Whoever lost would swear eternal loyalty and obedience to the winner. Simple and absolute. The kind of terms that make a story worth telling, regardless of which direction it resolves. They competed across every event: strength, endurance, the forge work itself, the shaping of raw metal into things of precision and quality through heat and pressure and skill. It was close, genuinely close, in ways that should have been impossible for a normal person matching themselves against Vulcan. The stranger competed with the competence of someone holding enormous capability deliberately in reserve, performing exactly as well as the situation required without revealing how much more was available. Whether this closeness was honest or a carefully calibrated restraint on his part is a question the lore leaves appropriately unresolved. In the craftsmanship events, Vulcan's work was judged superior. The stranger acknowledged this completely, without reservation, without attempting to renegotiate the terms. He had made a promise, and he honored it, and then he told Vulcan who he was. The pale stranger was the Emperor of mankind. He had come to this difficult volcanic world because one of his Primarchs had landed here, and the time had come to bring him home and give him the purpose he had been built for. The story, in its full form, is what the Salamanders call the Promethean Opus, a foundational narrative of their culture that propagated across the Imperium and settled into the status of a teaching story about recognition, purpose, and the relationship between where you come from and who you were always going to be. Vulcan knelt, not because the Emperor commanded it, Because in the moment of recognition, when everything clicked into its proper place with the precision of a well-made mechanism, the gesture was the only honest response. This was his father. The size, the heat resistance, the craftsmanship instinct, the kindness that had survived every hard thing Nocturne had thrown at it, the particular shape of his values and his capacities and his understanding of what mattered, all of it had been designed. All of it had been purposeful from before he could remember having a purpose. The 18th Legion, created from Vulcan's genetic material, was brought to Nocturne. Some of the warriors had been fighting a desperate holding action at a location called the Taurus Division, cut off from reinforcement and making the kind of stand that produces either victory or legend, depending on who is there to tell the story afterward. Vulcan's arrival unified what remained of them, and he gave them a name drawn from the great fire-resistant lizards of Nocturne's volcanic ranges, creatures whose primary talent was enduring conditions that eliminated everything else around them. Salamanders. The name was perfectly chosen, and everyone involved understood why. He gave them a name, and then he gave them a philosophy, which in the long run mattered more. He stood before his sons, these warriors who had been shaped from his own genetic blueprint into something superhuman, and he spoke the words that would be repeated for 10,000 years. He told them about the Promethean Creed. He told them about the Circle of Fire, about the relationship between destruction and transformation, about what endurance and craftsmanship and rebirth meant not as abstract concepts, but as active principles for living. And he told them something that most of the other Primarchs either didn't say or didn't believe or didn't think was relevant. He told them that the people they were going to be fighting for were the point, not the territory, not the political structures of the emerging Imperium, not the abstract momentum of the Great Crusade. The ordinary human beings who could not protect themselves, who were living in the shadow of the galactic nightmare that the Crusade was trying to address, who would live or die depending on whether the warriors arriving in their systems treated them as the purpose of the mission or as the acceptable background cost of it. Ferrus Manus, Primarch of the Iron Hands, and one of Vulcan's closest brothers and most frequent philosophical opponents, found this position tactically maddening. Not because Ferrus was cruel, but because Ferrus was relentlessly efficient, and efficiency and Vulcan's approach to protecting non-combatants were in constant tension. Vulcan would extend a campaign by weeks or months if the faster option required accepting higher civilian casualties. Ferrus would calculate the difference in Imperial lives between the faster campaign with its civilian losses and the slower one without. Note that the slower one frequently produced more total casualties when accounting for military losses during the extended period, and present these numbers as the decisive argument. Vulcan would present the specific people the numbers represented. He would name them, sometimes literally, from the intelligence reports his legionnaires compiled as a matter of standard practice on worlds they were operating on. He would describe the particular families and communities whose fate the tactical decision would determine. He was not trying to make Ferrus feel bad. He was trying to make sure that the decision-making process included the actual content of what was being decided about. The arguments between them were legendary among the officers of both legions, conducted in the particular good faith of people who genuinely respected each other and were genuinely committed to competing principles, neither of which was simply wrong. Ferrus's efficiency saved lives too, in the aggregate calculations. Vulcan's protection saved lives in the immediate, specific, named sense. The tension between those two kinds of saving lives was real and was never fully resolved, because it is the kind of tension that cannot be fully resolved. It is built into the nature of war. The Salamander's training under Vulcan became something genuinely unusual in the Imperial military. They were extremely effective fighters, carrying the heaviest heat-based weaponry available, and using it with the precision that Vulcan's emphasis on craftsmanship demanded. You don't bring a weapon to the field that you haven't practiced with until it is as familiar as your own hand. You don't fire into a situation where the consequences of the fire are uncertain. You take the time to do it correctly, because doing it correctly is the difference between a battle that achieves its purpose and one that achieves the tactical objective while creating a new problem of equivalent severity. But they also, consistently, spent the resources and the tactical complexity required to protect the people living in every theater they fought in. The worlds the salamanders pacified did not simply submit to imperial authority and calculate whether compliance was the least bad option available. They were offered something that resembled justice, because Vulcan had taken the time to make sure it did, and they became contributors to the Imperium, rather than resentful tributaries carrying a grudge that would generate future problems. The Great Crusade, for Vulcan, was a craft project conducted at galactic scale. He approached it with the patience and the attention, and the refusal to accept adequate when excellent was achievable that characterized everything he made in the Forge. He was not the fastest of the Primarchs. He was not the most aggressively territorial. He was not the one who racked up the most dramatic conquests in the least time. He was the one who did it right, which in the long run meant the worlds he touched tended to stay touched in ways that produced durable results. It is said among those who knew him that Vulcan was the Primarch most suited to his father's actual vision. Not the military machinery of the Crusade, but the civilization the Crusade was supposed to make possible. If the Great Crusade had ended the way the Emperor intended, Vulcan would have been the Primarch most qualified to help build the Imperium that was supposed to follow. The one with the patience and the genuine care for ordinary people and the philosophical framework for what a just civilization might look like. The Great Crusade did not end the way the Emperor intended. It ended with a trap on a black sand world, and a betrayal so complete that it took a very long time for anyone to understand the full scope of what had happened. Section 4. The Most Human of Giants, the Promethean Creed in full. Before following Vulcan into the catastrophe that awaited him at Istvan V, it is worth spending real time with the Promethean Creed, because it is not simply characterization, shorthand, or cultural flavor. It is a working philosophical framework for a very specific kind of existence, and the principles it contains have particular and personal relevance to Vulcan's biological nature, in ways that neither he nor the Nocturnians who developed it alongside him could have anticipated when they were first articulating them. The creed rests on 3 pillars: endurance, craftsmanship, rebirth. The words are familiar, but the content is richer than the words suggest. Endurance, as Vulcan understood and taught it, was not the passive absorption of suffering. This is the most common misreading of the concept, and it produces a Vulcan who is more stoic and less interesting than the actual one. What the creed means by endurance is the active refusal to be defined by what has been done to you. A person who endures does not pretend the damage isn't real, or that the suffering wasn't significant. They acknowledge it fully and process it honestly, and then they keep going. The keeping going is not despite the damage, but through it, and the crucial element is that it is a choice, made repeatedly and consciously, that what happened does not get to determine what happens next. On Nocturne, this was operational requirement rather than philosophical aspiration. Every 15 years, the planet destroyed what people had built and forced them to build again from whatever the time of trials had left standing. You could not afford to spend the months after such an event exclusively in grief for what was lost, not if the community was going to survive the following years long enough to need to rebuild again. The will to start over had to come from somewhere, and it came from the understanding, encoded in Nocturnian culture over many generations, that they had started over before and they were still here, and what the fire took could be made again because the people who knew how to make it were still alive. Vulcan absorbed this not as doctrine but as lived reality. He had watched Nenbel in the Forge. He had watched raw ore go into the fire and useful things come out. He had understood the transformation that heat and pressure and skilled attention made possible, and he had understood it not just as technique but as demonstration. The thing that went into the forge was not the same as the thing that came out. It was better. The destruction of the ore's original form was not a loss, but a necessary stage in the process of becoming something that could serve a purpose. Its raw form never could. Craftsmanship, the second pillar, was the active expression of what endurance made possible. Once you had survived the destruction of what you had, you rebuilt, and the creed insisted on rebuilding correctly. Not quickly, not adequately. Well, the philosophical content of this pillar is a sustained argument against the temptation to do things halfway, when speed or exhaustion, or the weight of ongoing difficulty, makes halfway feel like enough. Vulcan was the best craftsman of all the Primarchs, by most consistent assessments. Not because he had been given superior tools or unusual raw materials, though Nocturne's volcanic mineral wealth was genuinely extraordinary, but because he worked in a state of attention that was simply not satisfied with less than the thing that the object was trying to be. Every weapon he made was designed for the specific conditions it would encounter. Every piece of armor was fitted to the person who would wear it. He produced things individually, with full attention, and he expected his sons to approach everything they did with the same quality of focus. This extended from objects to plans to decisions to the way you conducted yourself in battle. The quality of what you produce is a moral matter, the creed argued, not just a practical one. Sloppy work was a form of disrespect for the purpose it was meant to serve and for the people who would depend on it. This is not an unusual position for a craftsman's culture, but Vulcan extended it from physical objects to every kind of work, including the work of being a warrior, a leader, and a person who cared about others. The third pillar, rebirth, is the most philosophically complex and the most personally significant, for reasons that would become clear only much later. The Circle of Fire, as it is also called, begins with a basic observation about Nocturne itself, and then builds a cosmology from that observation. The planet destroys itself and rebuilds. The lava consumes the old landscape and creates a new one. The ash that falls from the eruptions becomes, over geological time, the extraordinarily fertile volcanic soil from which the planet's mineral wealth and biological productivity derive. Nothing is actually lost. Everything consumed by the fire becomes part of the fire's material output, and that output goes on to become new things. The destruction is not an ending. It is a transformation, and the transformation requires that the thing being transformed be broken down completely, returned to its constituent elements, before it can be worked into something new. Applied to people, the principle holds that what we call death is a return to raw material. The consciousness that made a person who they were, the creed teaches, persists through the transformation in a different form. Not unchanged, because nothing returns from the fire as it was, but continuous. The essential character, the thing that constituted this specific person, rather than any other, is not extinguished. It is redistributed, changed in form, made into something that will eventually be present in new life. This is why salamanders mourn their dead differently from most cultures. They believe, with the specific conviction of people whose philosophy is demonstrated by the physical reality of the world they come from, that the dead are not lost. They are changed. They are part of the ongoing cycle. Grief is real and appropriate, but grief that treats death as a permanent ending is, in the Nocturnian understanding, a misreading of what death actually is. Now consider what this means for a being who is biologically a perpetual. Vulcan did not know he was a perpetual when he helped develop the Promethean Creed. He built the philosophy from his observation of Nocturne, and from the accumulated wisdom of the Nocturnian people, and from his own deep conviction about what endurance and transformation meant as principles for living. He constructed a cosmology of death and returned from sources that had nothing to do with his personal biology. And then, his personal biology turned out to be a direct, physical, undeniable demonstration of his philosophy in the most literal possible sense. He died, he rebuilt. He died again, he rebuilt again. The Circle of Fire, which had been spiritual teaching about the nature of loss and transformation, turned out to describe his experience of mortality with accuracy that could not be attributed to coincidence. The creed anticipated the biology, or the biology confirmed the creed. Either way, the fit between them is precise and satisfying, and this is one of the reasons the salamanders take the creed with the specific seriousness they do. Their Primarch did not merely teach the Circle of Fire as a philosophical position. He lived it repeatedly, in conditions that made the metaphor empirically real. The Promethean Creed also contains specific and distinctive teachings about the relationship between the salamanders and the ordinary people they protect, and these teachings are where Vulcan's approach diverges most sharply from the standard Space Marine model. Most chapters maintain significant distance from civilian populations. There are practical reasons for this, because Space Marines are not designed for close integration with normal human society. They are too large, too psychologically altered by the enhancement process, too obviously different in ways that make ordinary social interaction genuinely awkward for everyone involved. Most chapter cultures resolve this by constructing an identity around the exceptional nature of the Astartes as beings who serve humanity without being of it any longer. Vulcan had experienced the opposite of this during his years on Nocturne, and he rejected the standard construction not as a campaign, but simply by modeling a different approach. He had been Nembel's son. He had been his community's blacksmith and defender and counselor. He had known ordinary people intimately, cared about them specifically, fought for them personally. When he took command of his legion, he brought that experience with him, and he taught his sons that this was the right relationship, not the distant reverence that many chapters cultivated. The Salamanders maintain community presences in the sanctuary cities of Nocturne when they are not deployed. Battle Brothers live in bastions integrated into those communities, rather than isolated in distant fortresses. They are treated as leaders and elders within the community structure. They know the people living around them. They remember names. This changes the character of what they fight for. A warrior who knows the specific people whose safety depends on the battle's outcome fights differently from one who is fighting for an abstract principle. He has names and faces attached to the stakes. That level of personal investment produces a different quality of commitment, and the Salamanders' consistent record on civilian protection during their long history is the evidence that the investment translates into measurable outcomes. Vulcan was, by universal account among those who knew him, genuinely warm. In a setting full of beings who are described as noble, or honorable, or mighty, the warmth is unusual enough to be worth noting. He actually liked people. Not humanity as an abstract concept or a political constituency to be managed, but specific individuals with specific lives who deserve to have those lives treated with care. This quality was not naive, because nothing built by Nocturne was naive, but it was real, and it produced in him a way of being with other people that was different from what most beings of his power and nature managed. It is said by those who knew him well that Vulcan was the Primarch most suited to what his father was actually trying to build. Not the crusade machinery, but the civilization it was supposed to create. If the Great Crusade had succeeded in the way the Emperor intended, Vulcan would have been the Primarch most qualified to help build the peaceful Imperium that was supposed to follow. The one with the patience, the genuine investment in ordinary people's well-being, and the philosophical framework for what justice and community and the protection of the vulnerable actually required. That version of the future was destroyed at Istvan V. What followed required different things from Vulcan than the ones he had built himself to provide. He provided them anyway. Section 5. The Trap at Istvan. The World Burns. The Dropsite Massacre of Istvan V has the quality of genuine historical tragedy in the way that the worst disasters always do, where you read it knowing the outcome and watch every step toward it with the specific weight of foreknowledge. The trap was perfectly constructed. The betrayal was completely concealed. The Loyalists walked into it with the confidence of people who believed they were winning a war that had already been lost before any of them landed. The situation leading to Istvan V developed from Horus's fall. The War Master, the first among the Primarchs in authority, and the one most trusted by the Emperor, had been corrupted through events involving a wound on the moon of a world called Davin, and entities that should never have been given the access they found. The result was that Horus was no longer fighting for the Emperor, and he had spent months in careful secrecy, assembling a coalition of legions that would join him. 9 of the 20 Primarchs eventually fell to the traitor cause, though the full scope of the betrayal was concealed long enough to set the trap that would be sprung at Istvan V. 7 loyalist legions were sent to crush the traitors. 3 would form the first wave: Raven Guard under Korax, Iron Hands under Ferrus Manus, and Salamanders under Vulcan. 4 more, supposedly loyal, would form a second wave coming in reinforcement. The 3 loyalist legions descended into the Urgal Depression, a black sand volcanic plain, and engaged the traitor forces, and they were beginning to do what 3 full Space Marine legions in coordinated operation generally do, which is win. Then the second wave arrived. Iron Warriors, Night Lords, Word Bearers, Alpha Legion. They had never been loyal. They came down and they opened fire, not on the traitors. On the legions fighting below them, the loyalists were caught between the enemies they had been engaging and the betrayers who had just landed behind them. There was no coherent response possible to a double envelopment of that scale and speed. The killing ground had been designed for exactly this purpose. The Iron Warriors fired nuclear weapons into the densest concentration of salamanders on the field, into Vulcan's position. The explosion was comprehensive. Everything in the blast radius was consumed. The black sand of Istvan V became briefly something else, something hotter and less hospitable, and when it cooled, the position that had been Vulcan's position was simply gone. The salamander survivors searched afterward. They went over the battlefield inch by inch, looking for something, anything, that would tell them what had happened to their father. They found nothing, which was itself a kind of evidence, because a nuclear strike, comprehensive enough to leave no recoverable material, is comprehensive enough to destroy a Primarch. The official conclusion was that Vulcan had died in the blast. His sons carried that loss forward, along with all the other losses of that terrible day. The official conclusion was wrong, and in a very specific and important sense, it was always going to be wrong. Vulcan had been rebuilt by his biology from whatever the nuclear explosion left of him, and he had woken up surrounded by Night Lords, and Conrad Kurz had been there, and the decision that Kurz made in that moment would define months of what followed. He took him prisoner. Conrad Kurz, the Night Haunter, Primarch of the Night Lords, is one of the most psychologically complex figures in the Horus Heresy canon. He was born on a world called Nostramo, where the only law was violence, where the social structure was organized around the distribution of harm, where he had spent his formative years enforcing brutal order through the strategic application of terror, and had become very certain that this approach, whatever its costs, produced better outcomes than the alternatives available to him. He was not simply sadistic. He had a genuine philosophical position about the relationship between fear and compliance and the prevention of violence, and he could argue that position clearly and with considerable intelligence. He was also a seer, able to experience visions of possible futures with a clarity that was less a gift than a curse, because the clearest and most persistent vision he had ever had was of his own death. An assassin, dark hair, a blade. These details were settled in his mind with the certainty of something witnessed rather than merely anticipated. He was going to die at an assassin's hand, and he had known it from early in his life, and this knowledge had done things to his relationship with agency and choice, and the value of actions taken in a context where certain outcomes felt predetermined. He was also genuinely interested in Vulcan specifically, and in the philosophical question of whether there was any meaningful difference between Vulcan's violence in defense of innocence and his own violence in service of deterrence. He believed there wasn't. He intended to prove it, using the only test that he could apply with the thoroughness it required, which was the test of extremity. He killed Vulcan. Over and over and over, in every method he could devise, moving through variations that became increasingly elaborate as his frustration at the consistent failure of death to stick mounted into something approaching obsession. He burned him alive. He shot him at point-blank range with massed bolter fire. He threw him into the void of space without armor. He locked him in engine exhaust vents. He tore him apart with direct physical force. He cut off his head on at least one occasion. Each time, Vulcan rebuilt and woke up, sometimes in the same cell, sometimes in a different one, always in whatever state the regenerative process had managed to reconstruct from the available material. This is how Vulcan discovered what he was, not in a moment of triumph or revelation, but in the wreckage of repeated death, waking and dying, and waking again, in an endless grinding loop that Kurz was using both as torture and as the foundation of a philosophical demonstration. The demonstration was this: "You claim to be different from me," Kurz was saying with each death. "You claim that your violence serves a higher purpose than mine, but look at what you are, a thing that cannot die and cannot prevent the deaths around it, a being who will keep killing regardless of what philosophy he dresses it in. What is the actual difference between us?" Vulcan refused the argument, not because he denied the violence, because the violence was real and he knew it. But he refused to let Kurz collapse the distinction between violence in defense of the innocent and violence as an expression of contempt for whether the innocent lived or died. He held that distinction through every death and every resurrection, through the Davenite mind manipulation that Kurz arranged to trap Vulcan in visions where he failed to save hostages regardless of what he chose. through months of treatment that redefined his understanding of what a person could be pushed through and still remain themselves. There was a moment when Kurz put Vulcan in control of a battle machine and arranged it so that Vulcan's only choices were to kill Imperial Army prisoners and Raven Guard captives or turn the machine's weapons on himself. Vulcan turned the weapons on himself without hesitation. He chose his own death, rather than allow the people in front of him to be killed by his hand. Kurz, who had expected something more complicated, something that would provide more material for his philosophical argument, was apparently furious. At another point, Vulcan recovered sufficiently during one of the torture sequences to get his hands on one of his own weapons and use it to beat Kurz down to the edge of death. He had the opportunity. He had the physical capability. He did not take the killing blow. The accounts vary on his exact reasoning, but the consistent thread is that Vulcan recognized in that moment what the killing blow would mean, that it would prove Kurz's point by demonstrating that, beneath all the philosophy, there was a being who would destroy another when sufficiently pressed. Vulcan refused to provide that proof, which was its own kind of defiance. He escaped eventually, using the hidden teleportation mechanism built into one of his own weapons, which he had managed to retrieve during the chaos of one of the later sequences. He arrived on Macragge, homeworld of Robut Guillemot's Ultramarines, in a state that would most charitably be described as fractured. Months of dying and being rebuilt had done something to his consciousness that pure physical destruction couldn't have achieved. His memories were unreliable. His grip on his own identity was uncertain. He was as close to broken as a being with his nature could get. But he was there, still, again, as he would always be. Section 6. The Long Road Home. Vulcan lay on Macragge in various states of fractured consciousness for a period the lore doesn't precisely define, which is itself an indicator of how difficult the recovery process was. Guilliman received him and stabilized what could be stabilized from the outside, but the fracture in his mind was not something external intervention could repair. The work of reassembly had to come from Vulcan himself. Kurz arrived on Macragge. He had tracked his escaped prisoner, or had always intended to follow, and he came with the energy of someone who considers unfinished business a personal failing. The combat between the two Primarchs across the surface of Macragge was at the scale that fighting between two beings of their nature necessarily produced, leaving physical evidence of their passage through the city that would have occupied military engineers for considerable time. During this pursuit, the event occurred that demonstrated Vulcan's nature most completely to any witnesses. Kurz shot his head off. The body fell from a height, and Vulcan was alive again before it hit the ground. The regeneration was measured in seconds. Whatever process governs the reconstruction of a perpetual operates at a speed that makes death essentially a very brief interruption rather than a permanent state. This is also the point at which the Fulgurite entered the story. A perpetual named John Grammaticus had been carrying this object under instructions from an organization called the Cabal, a body of alien intelligences who had calculated that Horus winning the heresy was better for the long-term prospects of life in the galaxy than an Imperium that survived it, because their models suggested the surviving Imperium would eventually produce something worse. Their instrument was Grammaticus, whom they had directed to ensure Vulcan's permanent death. The theory was that a perpetual killed by another perpetual, or killed by the Fulgurite specifically, could be killed in a way that the regenerative process could not overcome. Eldrad Ulthrin, the Aeldari Farseer, appeared to Grammaticus with a different proposition. If Grammaticus used the Fulgurite himself to kill Vulcan, rather than passing it to a Primarch to wield, the effect would be different. Grammaticus would sacrifice his own perpetual nature in the act, becoming permanently mortal, but Vulcan's mind would be restored, completely and fully, while his body would still regenerate as it always had. The Fulgurite would strip whatever aspect of the perpetual condition was producing the fractured consciousness, essentially applying a kind of terrible medicine by using a death tool to restore rather than end. Grammaticus chose the sacrifice. He stabbed Vulcan with the Fulgurite and lost his immortality in the act, and Vulcan died in the specific way the Fulgurite produced, and then the biology did what it always did. He woke in the deep volcanic dark beneath Mount Deathfire on Nocturne, in conversation with an entity that called itself Deathfire personified. The nature of this entity is genuinely ambiguous in the lore. Whether it was a real manifestation of something connected to the mountain and the planet's spiritual traditions, or a projection of Vulcan's own recovering consciousness, finding a way to communicate with itself through symbolic form. Whatever it was, it showed him two weapons he had made, but had no memory of making. A thunderhammer named Erdrakul, a device called the Talisman of Seven Hammers, whose potential was enormous enough that it would eventually be installed in the Golden Throne itself as a component of the Emperor's life support. The entity told him to go to Terra. The siege was coming. He assembled 3 acolytes he called the Droxward. Eldrad had prepared a webway portal for them, deep in the rock beneath Nocturne, and they entered it and began the journey. The webway in this period was not the clean, reliable transit system it had been before the heresy's escalation. It was compromised in places, collapsing in others, dangerous throughout, in ways that hadn't existed before Chaos began applying deliberate pressure to its structure. Vulcan and his 3 companions fought for their survival through a satellite realm of Kamara, where the Dark Eldar, those same raiders he had driven from Nocturne in his youth, applied their full creativity to the problem of stopping them. From Komorog, they found their way to the fleet of Shadrach Medusan, the Shattered Legion's commander, who had been conducting a guerrilla war against Horus's forces from whatever resources the Istvan survivors could scrape together. Medusan was fighting a desperate holding action across multiple systems, and Vulcan's presence briefly gave that effort a renewed intensity before the journey to Terra could wait no longer. He arrived during the siege. He brought Erdrakul and himself and the specific fury of a being who had been killed more times than should have been possible, and was still, stubbornly, furiously, without any sign of the capacity for resignation, still there. He fought Magnus the Red during the siege, engaging the Crimson King in the direct physical confrontation that his hammer-based approach demanded, and the fact of his presence among the defenders contributed to the cumulative resistance that eventually held long enough for the heresy's final chapter to play out. When the siege ended, when Horus fell, and the Emperor was carried to the Golden Throne, Vulcan was among those still standing. He always was. Section 7. The Silence After the Storm. 3 millennia and a disappearance. The post-heresy period is complicated in the Salamander's history, in all the ways that the most consequential periods always are, producing thin documentary records in inverse proportion to their significance. The chapter was rebuilding from losses that had been catastrophic. The Dropsite massacre had reduced the Salamanders from a full legion of tens of thousands to a scattered remnant that spent the rest of the heresy fighting as survivors, rather than as a coherent military force, and the rebuild from that starting point was slow and costly, in ways that showed up in every aspect of chapter life for decades afterward. Vulcan stayed with them. This detail is significant when set against what some of his brothers chose during this period, because not all the surviving loyalist Primarchs remained with their legions once the immediate crisis had passed. Some departed on undisclosed missions. Some were driven away by the weight of grief or guilt or the sheer impossibility of being what they had been, in a world that had changed too completely for that role to remain available. Vulcan stayed. He sat with his sons in the ash of what the heresy had left, and he helped them count what remained, and he began the process of rebuilding, which was, after all, what the Promethean Creed had always been preparation for. The Codex Astartes debate was the central political conflict of the post-heresy reorganization. Guilliman proposed breaking the legions into smaller, more numerous, more independently capable chapters, removing the structural possibility of a single force large enough to threaten the Imperium if its loyalty shifted. The logic was sound. The lesson of Horus was that concentrated personal power, even when that power was initially genuinely loyal, created catastrophic vulnerability if the concentration shifted. Vulcan's objection was practical and specific. His legion was already devastated. The Salamanders didn't need to be divided to be safe. They needed to be built back up from near nothing, and dividing near nothing into smaller pieces of near nothing didn't make the Imperium safer from the Salamanders. It just made the Salamanders less capable of the role they existed to fill. He argued for an exception. He lost the argument because Guilliman's structural logic was compelling enough to override specific circumstances. But the salamanders implemented the codex in the characteristically Nocturnian way, which is to say they followed the requirement as they understood it and filled the interpretation with their own content. 7 companies rather than 10, but each company larger than the standard. The letter honored, the spirit adjusted to preserve what mattered. Some sources say Vulcan led the salamanders for 3 entire millennia after the heresy, a span of time that defies easy comprehension. 3,000 years is longer than most human civilizations last from beginning to end. It is enough time for the chapter's original veterans of the heresy to die of old age, for several entire generations of new warriors to be recruited and trained and serve full careers, and retire or die in battle and be replaced by others, for the galaxy's political landscape to reshape significantly multiple times. 3 millennia of active leadership by a Primarch would be an extraordinary record by any measure. Other sources suggest Vulcan disappeared much earlier, shortly after the immediate post-heresy period. The discrepancy in sources is itself meaningful, suggesting that Vulcan's movements during whatever years he spent after the heresy were difficult to track, whether by design or because the chapter's records of this period were lost or damaged in subsequent conflicts. The truth of the timeline is one of the questions the lore leaves deliberately open, adding to the mystery of his departure rather than resolving it cleanly. What is certain, regardless of when exactly it occurred, is that before he left, Vulcan made 3 decisions that would define the next 10,000 years of his chapter's existence. He went to the vault beneath Prometheus and made 9 objects, 9 artifacts of extraordinary craftsmanship, made with the full skill of a being who had been practicing for centuries and who approached this particular set of objects with a seriousness that exceeded even his usual standard. Each one was significant in its own way, carrying properties and capabilities that would eventually cause the 41st Millennium's Adeptus Mechanicus to classify them as beyond their ability to fully analyze or replicate. He made 9 objects and scattered them across the galaxy in locations that only he knew, hiding them not from enemies specifically, but as the pieces of a test, set out for the right people to find when they had developed into the right kind of people to find them. Second, he created or assembled, or both, the Tome of Fire. This was not a single book, but a collection of texts and objects and material items, some of them philosophical writings and practical teachings, some of them prophetic passages that described future events, with a precision that accumulated credibility over the centuries as those events occurred. Among the tome's contents were clues to the locations of the 9 artifacts, embedded in layers of allegory and riddle and symbolic language that revealed themselves gradually as the reader developed the specific understanding required to decode them. The tome was designed to be read over time by people who were growing into its content, rather than decoded by anyone with sufficient raw intelligence applied at a single sitting. Third, he left his sons a message. When the officer known as the Forge Father of the Salamanders, the warrior who took the search for the 9 artifacts as his sole purpose, and renounced his former name to take the Primarch's name, had found all 9 and returned them to Nocturne, Vulcan would return. The Tome of Fire described the context of that return in terms of the Imperium's greatest need, of a final war against enemies of a scope and character that the chapter would recognize when they faced it. He would come back for that war, to lead his sons through it. The artifacts had to come home first. The sons had to prove themselves worthy of the test. He left this message, and then he was gone. The Salamanders created the office of the Forge Father in response, a sacred role that has been maintained without interruption across 10,000 years. A chapter captain is chosen. He renounces the name and identity he had before taking the office, because the office is larger than any individual who holds it. He takes the name Vulcan as his own, because the search is done in the Primarch's name and by the Primarch's authority. He devotes his existence to finding the artifacts, with access to the chapter's full military resources at any time he needs them, because every salamander understands that nothing is more important than the quest. For approximately 1,500 years after Vulcan's disappearance, the search continued. The galaxy changed around it. The Imperium went through crises and survived them, and built new structures to replace the ones that broke. The salamanders fought and recruited and trained and maintained their culture with remarkable consistency. The Promethean Creed remained the foundation, The Forge Fathers' quest remained the central purpose, and the belief that their Primarch was alive somewhere remained as solid as the volcanic rock of their homeworld. Then something happened that brought Vulcan back to the galaxy's attention in a way that no one had expected, and that would end in an explosion that left his status uncertain all over again. Section 8. The Return War of the Beast. In 544 of the 32nd millennium, the worst greenskin invasion in human history began, and it began with a speed and scale that left the Imperium genuinely wrong-footed in ways it had not been since the heresy. The warlord leading it was called simply the Beast, and this name understated the situation in almost every dimension. He was enormous by even the extraordinary standards of the largest orc war bosses. 10 meters of genetically enhanced mass, organized around a will and an intelligence that the greenskin race was not supposed to be able to produce at that level. He spoke perfect Imperial Gothic. He understood strategy and logistics at a level that the orc species was not believed capable of reaching. He had organized an orc horde of unprecedented size and kept it organized through an act of sustained dominance that redefined what the upper limit of orc individual capability actually was. He built attack moons. This bears repetition for context. He converted actual moons, natural satellites of inhabited worlds, into weapon platforms and launched them at targets, including, eventually, Terra itself. The weapon he deployed at the throne world was not a ship or a fleet, but a moon-sized object aimed at the planet like a thrown stone. The Imperium intercepted it. The fact that this was the level of response required gives some sense of the scale of the crisis. The war that followed hit the Imperium at multiple points simultaneously, wearing down defenses across the galaxy, while the administrative infrastructure of the Imperium, which had been calcifying through the centuries since the heresy into something impressive-looking but slow to respond, failed to coordinate the response with the speed the situation required. The High Lords argued. Resources were misallocated or withheld pending authorizations that moved through committee processes designed for peacetime. Chapters that should have been fighting were waiting for orders. The bureaucracy of a galactic civilization demonstrated its limitations under stress with comprehensive thoroughness. Into this situation, the Inquisition disclosed a piece of information they had been holding. Vulcan had been found on a planet called Caldera. Caldera was a volcanic world. The Salamanders, hearing this detail in the subsequent accounts, reportedly found it entirely in keeping with their Primarch's choices across his documented history. He had been there for some period of time that the accounts don't precisely establish, alone, fighting off a greenskin invasion force that the reports described as numbering in the millions. Not winning in any strategic sense, not eliminating the force or retaking the planet's surface, but converting the tactical situation into something personal through the application of sufficient violence per encounter that the greenskin forces on Caldera had reorganized their tactical priorities around the question of where he would appear next, rather than around the original mission of planetary conquest. He had, essentially, made himself the greenskins' primary problem through the simple expedient of being so continuously and comprehensively dangerous that dealing with him took priority over the stated objective. This is a classic application of the endurance principle, applied at Primarch scale. When the Imperial fleet arrived, the combination of their numbers and his presence was sufficient to break the greenskin force and begin its dispersal. Vulcan allowed himself to be brought aboard the fleet and met Lord Commander Corland, the last surviving officer of the Fists of Dorn's lineage, and the man who had become the Imperium's effective military coordinator for this crisis, through the process of everyone above him dying in the war. Corland was a good man in an extremely difficult position, and Vulcan recognized both qualities with the specific appreciation of someone who had been in enough extremely difficult positions to know what genuine quality looks like when it's operating under maximum pressure. He agreed to come to Terra. When he arrived and found the High Lords arguing about their relative precedence and authority while the galaxy burned around them, he addressed the situation with the patience of someone who had been having this conversation in one form or another for 10,000 years, and with the authority of someone who was several magnitudes more impressive than anyone they'd been speaking with before his arrival. He chose not to execute any of them, which in the circumstances was notable restraint. He told them to stop arguing and start fighting. He declared that he would lead the Imperium's forces to Ullanor, where the beast had established his capital, and that he would end the immediate threat personally. The campaign to Ullanor was the kind of military engagement that produces legends because the people who survive it need to make sense of what they went through. The Imperial fleet had to buy its landing opportunity by sacrificing damaged warships as living weapons, sending them on suicide runs against the Orc energy shield around Gorkograd to create the window that allowed troops to land. The urban warfare through Gorkograd itself was the kind of grinding close-quarters combat that Space Marines are optimized for. But that costs even the optimized dearly when the enemy is both numerous and organized. During the approach, Vulcan had been alone in his quarters, working on Doomtremor, the thunderhammer he had built during the heresy, the one too heavy for armored Terminators to lift, the one capable of absorbing incoming energy and redirecting it outward. He was refining it, improving it, doing the craftsman's work of preparing the tool that the coming task required, which was also the meditative practice that Nocturnian tradition had always taught as the right way to prepare for something important. You work the forge. You focus your hands and your attention on making something excellent, and when the time comes, you pick up the thing you have made and you use it. He came out of his quarters when the fleet reached Ullanor and led the final assault with the focused intensity of someone who had known all along how this was going to end and had been preparing himself for it honestly. The final confrontation was in the beast's Temple Gargant, a walking war machine the size of a Titan that the warlord had built at the exact location on Ullanor's surface where the Emperor and the Primarchs had gathered millennia earlier after the ancient Ullanor triumph. The Great Crusade campaign that had cleared the planet of an earlier Greenskin Empire. The choice of location was deliberate. The beast understood history, or at least its symbolic weight. He had built his monument on the site of the Imperium's old triumph. He was making a very specific point about succession and dominance. Vulcan went in with a strike force, fought through the interior of the Gargant to the chamber where the beast waited. The beast revealed he could speak Imperial Gothic, fluent and contemptuous, and delivered the kind of speech that a being who has built the largest Greenskin Empire in recorded history believes he has earned the right to deliver. Humanity on its knees. The end coming. He would be its instrument. Vulcan looked at him and made the decision that Corlund recognized even as it was being made. He told Corlund to get everyone out. Corlund ordered the evacuation. The Astartes withdrew from the temple, those who could, fighting their way back through the Gargant's corridors under fire. The objections were overruled by the combined authority of a Primarch's direct command and the practical recognition that what was about to happen in that generator chamber was not going to be survivable by anyone who did not have a very specific and very unusual relationship with the concept of survivability. Vulcan tackled the beast. Not a duel, not a careful exchange of blows, not the kind of combat that looks impressive from a tactical distance. He grabbed the 10-meter-tall warboss and threw himself bodily into the power generator, taking them both into it. The generator was saturated with concentrated greenskin energy, the psychic force generated by the largest orc horde in history's collective will. Millions of alien minds focused entirely on fighting and winning. Contact with that much raw force would have ended anything that didn't have what Vulcan had. He absorbed it, channeled it, used the specific qualities of his endurance and his nature to process the energy rather than be destroyed by it. And he brought Doomtremor down on the beast's face with everything that combination could generate. And he detonated the generator, and the explosion destroyed the Temple Gargant, and apparently everything within it. The beast's horde, deprived of the extraordinary individual whose presence had been the organizing principle holding it together, dissolved into the chaos that is the natural state of greenskin society without a sufficiently dominant war boss. The War of the Beast, for all practical purposes, ended on Ullanor. No body was recovered. There never had been, with Vulcan. The Imperium classified him presumed dead. Lord Commander Corlund said privately that he believed Vulcan had survived because Corlund had been close enough to the Primarch during the campaign to have some understanding of what he was. The Salamanders, when informed of the Ullanor events, issued their collective assessment. They kept searching. Section 9. The 9 Artifacts and the Living Quest. The 9 Artifacts of Vulcan are one of the most interesting constructs in all of 40K chapter lore and not simply because of their individual properties or the accumulated drama of the hunt for them. They are interesting because of what they reveal about their maker's understanding of trust and distance, and the relationship between a Primarch and the sons he cannot be with. They are a craftsman's solution to a craftsman's problem. How do you maintain a relationship with people you love across an indefinite period of absence? And how do you ensure that the relationship remains meaningful, rather than becoming a comfortable fiction that both sides maintain, without either taking it seriously anymore? Vulcan's answer was to make the relationship's continuation contingent on active investment. The artifacts had to be found. The search had to be conducted with genuine commitment and genuine cost. The Tome of Fire had to be read and reread and wrestled with across generations by people who were actually trying to understand it rather than treating it as a decorative piece of chapter mythology. The artifacts would not deliver themselves. The chapter would have to develop into the kind of organization worthy of them, and the development would be demonstrated by the finding, not just claimed in words. The story of how the 9 artifacts came to be scattered across the galaxy begins with a conversation that happened before Istvan V, in the vault beneath Prometheus, where Vulcan had stored the products of a lifetime of craftsmanship. He brought Forgemaster Tikel to the vault before the heresy consumed everything, and showed him what was there. Thousands of objects. A Primarch's century-spanning output, maintained in perfect condition in chambers designed for preservation. Weapons and tools and devices of extraordinary capability, each one made with the full attention and skill that Vulcan brought to everything he made, which meant each one was, by definition, extraordinary, even by the standards of a galaxy that contained some remarkable things. Vulcan told Tikel he intended to destroy all of it. His reasoning was direct. He had watched Horus fall. He had understood what it meant, that someone as capable and as trusted as Horus could be turned. If that was possible, then the weapons made in loyalty could not be trusted to remain instruments of loyalty indefinitely. The things he had made with every intention that they serve, protective purposes, could, if circumstances changed in the wrong direction, become instruments of the opposite. He did not want to be the maker of things that eventually hurt the people he had made them to protect. Tikel argued against the destruction with the eloquence and the feeling of someone who genuinely loved these objects as expressions of his Primarch's character and capability. They were a legacy, he said, evidence of what Vulcan had been and what he valued, proof of what was possible when a Primarch's gifts were applied to the craft of making rather than only to the craft of destroying. Losing them would be a different kind of loss from any battlefield defeat, and one that could not be recovered from. Vulcan relented, partially. He told Tikel he could choose 7 objects from the vault that would be preserved as the legacy. Tikel made his choices with the anguish of someone trying to save what matters most when the list is much longer than the spaces available for saving. He chose 7, and with the 2 objects Vulcan had already decided to keep, the 9 artifacts were established. Then Istvan V happened, and the heresy, and the siege of Terra, and the long aftermath. And roughly 1,000 years after the heresy's end, Vulcan took the 9 and scattered them across the galaxy as the terms of the test he was setting for his sons. In the 41st millennium, 5 of the 9 have been recovered. The Spear of Vulcan was one of the earliest recoveries. Its location revealed through one of the tome's prophetic passages that unlocked at a specific point in the chapter's history and led the Forgefather of that era to a world where the spear had been kept in conditions that had preserved it across the centuries. The current Forgefather, Vulcan Histan, carries it into battle. Kezere's mantle is a cloak made from the hide of one of Nocturne's great drake salamanders, the creatures whose fire resistance inspired the chapter's name. Vulcan's craftsmanship enhanced properties that were already exceptional. The mantle can withstand heat and fire-based damage that would reduce ceramite armor to slag without inconveniencing its wearer. Histan wears it. The Gauntlet of the Forge is a weapon gauntlet of extraordinary capability, combining offensive power with defensive function in the way that Vulcan always preferred his work to be designed, things that protect you being also the things you fight with. Histan carries it as well, meaning the current Forgefather personally bears 3 of the 5 recovered artifacts into every engagement. The Chalice of Fire is the largest object Vulcan ever built, a vast forged ship of extraordinary capacity that now orbits Prometheus, serving as the primary manufacturing facility for the chapter's war gear. Its recovery story involves centuries of drift through the void in emergency stasis, the crew that had been trying to protect it entering stasis when the damage became too extensive to address with available resources, waiting for rescue that eventually came. It was found drifting in the dark, intact inside, and brought home. The Eye of Vulcan is a series of orbital defense lasers connected to the Chalice of Fire in a system that protects Prometheus from orbital assault. It sits alongside the Chalice as infrastructure rather than a deployable field weapon, the two largest of the recovered artifacts serving together as permanent installations around the chapter's fortress moon. 5 recovered, 4 remain. The Engine of Woes is known by name and nothing else. The tome's passages about it are among the most carefully guarded portions of the text, precisely because what the name implies and the tome's cryptic suggestions confirm is that this artifact operates at a scale of potential destruction significant enough that the information about its location needs to be controlled carefully. Its form, its size, its function beyond what the name broadly suggests, all remain unknown in the 41st millennium. The Obsidian Chariot is named for the dark volcanic glass that is one of Nocturne's most characteristic materials, the material that forms when lava cools rapidly and produces a substance both beautiful and sharp-edged. Whether the chariot is literally a vehicle or uses the word as metaphor for some other kind of conveyance or capability, the tome has not yet clarified to the satisfaction of the Forge Fathers who have wrestled with it. The Unbound Flame. In the context of everything Vulcan believed about fire, as the symbol and agent of transformation and rebirth, this name carries enormous potential weight. An unbound flame is a fire that has not yet found its purpose or its limits, a fire that is still in the process of becoming what it will be. The artifact could be a weapon of extraordinary heat-based destruction, a device that generates the specific conditions the Circle of Fire describes philosophically, or something that operates on a level where the fire metaphor points at something the physical description of flame only begins to capture. The Song of Entropy. This is the most philosophically complex of the 4 names, because entropy in Vulcan's philosophical framework is not simply physical decay. It is the process by which ordered things return to their constituent elements, the mechanism that makes transformation possible, the force that allows the Circle of Fire to operate by dissolving what exists so it can be made into what comes next. A Song of Entropy would be something that applies this process deliberately and with precision. The range of what that might mean in practice is wide enough to sustain a great deal of speculation. The Tome of Fire's clues to these 4 remaining artifacts are embedded in passages that have not yet yielded their interpretations. This is consistent with how the tome has always worked. The clues reveal themselves when the reader has developed into the right kind of reader to understand them, not as a simple test of intelligence or persistence, but as a test of the specific kind of wisdom that comes from genuinely living the Promethean creed, rather than studying it as an external text. You cannot decode Vulcan's riddles without becoming, in some important sense, a person Vulcan would recognize as one of his. Vulcan Heastan has been the Forge Father for long enough that his name has become closely associated with the quest's current phase. He is an exceptional warrior by any measure, enhanced further by the artifacts he carries, and he has devoted the existence he had before taking the Forge Father's office entirely to the search. Every campaign the Salamanders run is evaluated partly against whether it advances the quest. Every piece of intelligence about possible artifact locations is prioritized above almost everything else. The chapter's full military strength is available to Heastan at his request, without committee review or authorization processes, because the quest takes precedence over everything. This level of sustained institutional commitment to a single mission across 10,000 years is genuinely remarkable. Most organizations, even ones with very clear purpose and very strong culture, find that the urgency of long-standing missions erodes over time, as the original participants are replaced by people for whom the mission's original weight is second-hand rather than first-hand. The Salamanders have maintained the Forge Father's quest with active, costly commitment across more generations than most human civilizations span from beginning to end. This speaks to the depth to which the Promethean creed is actually lived, rather than merely professed, and to the genuine belief that completing the quest is not a historical tradition, but a necessary and achievable step towards something real. They believe their Primarch is coming back. They have been believing it for 10,000 years. They have been working toward the conditions of his return, with real resources and real commitment for every one of those years. And the case for believing they are right is stronger than most people who haven't looked at the evidence closely tend to assume. Section 10. Vulcan Lives. The evidence for the return. Let us assemble what we know. Let us lay out the case for Vulcan's survival and potential return in the current era, not as wishful thinking, but as a logical argument supported by the lore's own internal evidence, and let us see where that argument leads. Vulcan is a perpetual. In the documented biology of the Warhammer setting, a perpetual is a specific category of human mutant possessing an extraordinary form of regeneration, one that operates at a level deep enough to reconstruct the individual from death, rather than merely healing damage before death occurs. This is not accelerated healing. This is rebuilding from conditions that result in complete physical destruction. The mechanism is not fully explained in the lore, and probably shouldn't be, because explaining it fully would require either specific scientific content that the setting's aesthetic doesn't need, or a hand wave that would undermine the sense that there is genuine cost involved. What matters is what it does, and what it does is documented. Vulcan survived a nuclear strike at Istvan V and rebuilt from it. He survived months of varied and comprehensive killing at Konrad Kurz's hands, including decapitation, space exposure, incineration, and methods specific enough to the Night Haunter's creativity that the polite approach is not to enumerate them all and rebuilt from each one. He survived the Fulgurite, an object specifically described in the lore as capable of killing a perpetual permanently, and rebuilt from it with his mind restored. He survived the generator explosion on Ulanor and the absorption of an enormous concentrated orc energy field, and rebuilt from it. In each case, the deaths were more extreme than the ones before. Nuclear weapons, dedicated torture sustained across months, a purpose-built anti-perpetual weapon, an explosion that destroyed a Titangent-class war machine from the inside while absorbing a massive psychic energy discharge. Each subsequent death raised the bar for what his biology had to overcome, and there is no confirmed case in the entire lore of a Vulcan death that produced a confirmed permanent result. The Ulanor explosion is the most extreme entry on that list. It destroyed a Temple Gargant, which is a Titangent-scale walking war machine. It apparently destroyed the beast, one of the most physically powerful orc war bosses ever documented. No body was recovered, not because the aftermath wasn't examined, but because there was no body to recover, which is consistent with every previous instance of Vulcan's death in the historical record. He is not there after the explosion in a way that registers as a corpse. He is in transition, in the process that his biology undergoes between one form and the next. The Imperium declared him dead. This is worth examining in context. The Imperium also declared the lion dead while he was sleeping inside the rock. The Imperium has historically been somewhat optimistic in its applications of the word dead to Primarchs, who are not in fact dead. This is not a criticism. The Imperium is making assessments based on available information, and the available information in both cases was consistent with a determination of death. But the pattern exists, and it is worth noting when evaluating the reliability of the official determination in Vulcan's case. The Salamander's response to the official determination was consistent with their response to every other piece of information that suggested their Primarch was gone. They continued the quest. They maintained the Forgefather's office. They kept searching. This is not the behavior of an organization that privately agrees their Primarch is dead, but maintains the quest as a cultural continuity exercise. This is the behavior of an organization that has information supporting a different conclusion and is acting on that information rather than on the official determination. That information is the Tome of Fire. The tome's prophetic passages have been proving themselves accurate across 10,000 years of chapter history, accumulating the kind of credibility that comes not from any single prediction, but from a consistent record of accuracy over a very long period. The tome describes Vulcan's return in the present tense of something that will happen when conditions are met, not in the conditional tense of something that might happen if everything aligns correctly. The conditions are being actively worked toward. 5 artifacts have been found. 4 remain. The chapter is genuinely searching for the 4 remaining ones with the full commitment that the Forge Father's resources and authority provide. Now consider the era Indomitus and what it looks like from inside the setting. The Great Rift has split the galaxy in 2, Imperium Sanctus and Imperium Nihilus. The Daemon Primarchs are more active than at any point since the heresy. Fulgrim is stirring. Chaos is pressing on fronts that were thought relatively stable. The Lion has returned and is moving with purposes that align with, but are not fully disclosed to the broader Imperium. Guillemon is running a crusade across Imperium Sanctus while managing a political administration that is already straining under his demands for accountability. The existential character of the threats facing humanity has shifted from the sustained, grinding pressure of the previous era into something that looks qualitatively different, more concentrated, more final in its ambitions. The Tome of Fire describes the context of Vulcan's return as the final war against enemies of humanity. Not a war. The final war. The one that the chapter will recognize when they face it, because everything the tome's prophetic passages pointed toward will converge in it. Looking at the era Indomitus from inside the setting, with the galaxy split and chaos pressing from every direction, and the threat environment escalating in ways that make the previous era look relatively manageable by comparison, the question of whether this matches the tome's description of the return context is not one that the Salamanders are likely to answer with a confident negative. Consider also the specific words Vulcan used before the Ullanor explosion. He told Lord Commander Corland that he would speak well of him to Rogel Dorn. Not spoke well, past tense. Will speak, future tense. At the time of this statement, Rogel Dorn was officially listed as dead, killed in a boarding action against a Chaos vessel in the centuries following the heresy. No body was recovered from that event either. Vulcan spoke of Dorn as a person he expected to have an actual conversation with, which implies either that Vulcan expected to meet Dorn in some form of literal afterlife, which is not consistent with his general philosophical orientation toward material reality, or that Vulcan knew something about Dorn's actual status that the official record didn't capture. A perpetual who has died and come back dozens of times has a more nuanced relationship with the concept of death's permanence than beings for whom it occurs exactly once. Vulcan may have had a specific understanding of how the perpetual condition relates to what most people call death that informed his comment about Dorn in ways the surviving accounts don't fully record. The orc energy absorption on Ullanor is worth thinking about more carefully than it has been, because it may be the most interesting detail of the entire event. The Greenskin collective psychic field, the force generated by Orc Society's unified will toward fighting and winning, is one of the most powerful ambient psychic phenomena in the setting. It is not just energy in the physics sense. It is reality-affecting force in the specific Orc way, where sufficient Orc belief in something creates conditions that make that something more probable. When Vulcan absorbed that field into his perpetual biology, when he channeled it through himself in the act of his final strike against the beast, the long-term effects on his regeneration process are not something the lore has addressed directly. The Circle of Fire teaches that nothing returns from the fire as it was. Vulcan has believed this about other things for his entire existence. He built a cosmology around the principle that the fire changes what it touches, and that the change is not a diminishment, but a transformation into something new. He has also been changed by every death he has undergone, in ways the lore hints at, but doesn't fully specify. The Vulcan, who came out of the months of Kurz's torture, was different from the one who went in, even after his mind was restored. The Vulcan who woke beneath Mount Deathfire after the Fulgurite was different again. Whatever comes out of the Ullanor generator fire, if and when the process completes, may be different from all the previous versions in ways that the accounts of the event have not yet been able to capture because it hasn't happened yet in the narrative's timeline. There is also the matter of what the explosion actually involved at a metaphysical level. The generator that Vulcan detonated was not just a physical power source. It was a focus point for the accumulated psychic energy of the largest Greenskin war effort in documented history. a concentration of the specific force that makes the orc species one of the most dangerous in the galaxy, precisely because it is not subject to the normal limitations on what is physically possible. Vulcan absorbed that force and then converted it into a kinetic strike that ended the beast. The question of what residue that process leaves in a perpetual biology, what traces of orc energy might be integrated into the reconstruction process when the biology does what it does after death, is genuinely open. The answer might be that the residue is minimal and the next Vulcan is the same Vulcan in all the ways that matter. But the answer might also be something more interesting than that. Something that makes the next incarnation different in ways that the Circle of Fire would recognize as transformation rather than diminishment. The battle cry of the salamanders is not just a morale tool or a cultural tradition. It is a collective statement of position, maintained across 10,000 years by an organization that has every reason to have updated its beliefs based on available evidence and has consistently declined to do so. When a salamander shouts that Vulcan lives, he is not performing optimism. He is stating what he believes to be factually correct based on the evidence available to him and to his chapter across a very long period of investigation. The alternative position, that Vulcan is permanently dead, requires a specific argument that the Ullanor explosion was different from all the previous ones, in a way that produced the permanent result that the nuclear blast and the fulgurite and the sustained torture all failed to produce. This argument would need to identify what was specifically different about Ullanor that broke the pattern. The scale of the explosion? Previous deaths have been reviewed above. The orc energy absorption? Novel. But the physics of why it would specifically produce permanent death rather than a more complex recovery are not obvious. The absence of a body? Consistent with every other instance of Vulcan's death in the record. The simpler argument, the one that requires the fewest additional assumptions beyond what the lore has established, is that the Ullanor explosion was another death in the series and produced another recovery in the series. The recovery is taking longer, or is more complex, or produced a different result than the previous ones, which would be consistent with the increased extremity of the event relative to previous deaths. But it did not produce a different category of result. Vulcan is alive. He is somewhere in the galaxy, in whatever state the recovery process has produced from the materials available after the Ullanor explosion. He may be recognizably himself. He may be changed in ways that will require time and context to understand. But he is there, and he is waiting, and the conditions that the Tome of Fire describes as the trigger for his return are being assembled by the galaxy's own escalating crisis faster than any deliberate planning could have managed. 4 artifacts remain to be found. The Forge Father is searching for them. The tome's prophecies continue to reveal themselves as the chapter continues to develop into the kind of organization capable of understanding them. And somewhere in the volcanic dark, in a form that might be old or new, or some synthesis the fire has produced, the most patient and the most enduring of the Primarchs is doing what he has always done in the hard spaces between one thing and the next. He is enduring. He is waiting for the work to be done by the people he trusted it to. He is being, in the most Nocturnian way possible, patient. When the 9th artifact comes home to Nocturne and is placed in the volcanic soil of the world that made him, the fires of Mount Deathfire will do what the fires of that mountain have always done. They will announce that something remarkable has happened. They will illuminate the dark. They will demonstrate the principle that Vulcan spent his entire existence teaching and living and being. That what the fire takes, the fire can also give back. That what is destroyed is not lost but changed. That the Circle of Fire is not a metaphor, but a description of something real. They will announce that the wait is over. That the circle is complete. That the Forge Father's 10,000 years of searching have produced the result they were always working toward. They will announce what the salamanders have known all along, in the 2 words that are both a battle cry and a statement of fact, and a theological claim, and a scientific observation, and a promise made by a Primarch who keeps his promises. Vulcan lives. That is the story of the Primarch who the galaxy wrote off, and the salamanders never stopped searching for. The being who cannot die, who chose to disappear, who left his sons a promise written in objects scattered across the stars, and in fire poetry inked partly in his own blood. The most compassionate of the demigods, the most patient, the one who stood in the center of a burning village with 2 hammers and refused to hide and who carried that refusal through every death and every torture and every long silence that followed, and who built a philosophy around the principle that what the fire destroys, the fire can give back, and who then proceeded to spend 10,000 years being a living demonstration of that principle, whether the galaxy paid attention or not. If this story moved you or gave you something to think about, I would love for you to share it with someone who deserves to know it. Every person who finds their way to this kind of deep lore exploration through a recommendation from someone who thought of them while watching is someone I'm genuinely glad to have here. The community this channel is building is built entirely on people who care about this setting at the level where the stories actually matter. Hit subscribe, come back for more. There are more stories like this one, Primarchs with mysteries attached to them, chapters with histories that deserve more than a passing summary, events in the 40K timeline that change the way you see everything around them when you look at them closely enough. Thank you for being here. Thank you for watching. Until next time, stay curious, stay warm, and remember, present tense. No hesitation, no apology. Vulcan Lives. Supplemental section. The nature of the perpetual understanding. What cannot die? To truly appreciate what Vulcan survival means in the context of the 40K setting, it is worth spending more time with the concept of the perpetual itself, because it is one of the most quietly extraordinary ideas in all of Warhammer lore, and it gets less attention than it deserves in most discussions of the Primarchs and their fates. The Perpetuals, as they are identified in the Horus Heresy novels, are a category of human being who possess a form of biological regeneration so complete and so fundamental that it operates even after conditions that should result in total death, not accelerated healing. Not the enhanced physical resilience that Space Marines possess through their augmentations. Something genuinely different in kind. Something that functions at a level below the normal mechanisms of life and death. Reconstructing the individual from whatever remains after destruction is sufficiently complete to constitute what everyone else would recognize as death. The Perpetuals we meet across the Horus Heresy lore include the Emperor himself, who is perhaps the first and most important Perpetual in the setting. They include figures like Olanius Person, who was old even by human standards before the Emperor was born, and who had lived through multiple periods of human history, including the ancient Terran past. They include John Grammaticus, who was a more recent Perpetual and whose sacrifice of his immortality in the act of using the Fulgurite on Vulcan is one of the most emotionally resonant moments in the entire heresy narrative, precisely because of what he was giving up. What makes Vulcan unusual among even the Perpetuals is the combination of his perpetual nature with his Primarch-level physical capabilities. A normal Perpetual is functionally immortal, but not necessarily superhuman in the combat sense. They will rebuild from death, but they can still be killed in ways that bypass the regeneration, or so the implication runs. Vulcan is a Perpetual who is also a Primarch, meaning that his baseline before the regeneration even becomes relevant is already at a level that very few things in the galaxy can meaningfully threaten. The double layer of protection this creates is part of why his survival of the Olanor explosion is, while extraordinary, not inconsistent with what the lore establishes about his capabilities. The Emperor's nature, as a Perpetual, is worth considering in this context as well, because the Emperor's relationship with death and continuation is the most extreme example of what a Perpetual can ultimately become or endure. The Emperor is currently sustaining a form of existence on the Golden Throne that is neither fully alive in the normal sense nor fully dead, persisting in a state that the available technology and psychic power can maintain but not reverse. This state is its own form of endurance, and whether it will eventually produce a full death or a further transformation is one of the central, unresolved questions of the current setting. Vulcan is the Emperor's son, and both are Perpetuals. The Emperor made Vulcan from altered versions of his own genetic material, and whatever makes a Perpetual what they are was present in that material. The parallel between father and son, in this respect, is not incidental. It is built into the structure of Vulcan's existence. The Circle of Fire that Vulcan teaches as the foundational principle of the Promethean Creed is not just philosophy for his sons. It is a description of his own relationship with death and continuation, encoded in teaching form before he fully understood his own biology. The question of what the regeneration process actually involves at a biological or possibly metaphysical level is one the lore doesn't fully answer, and appropriately so. The mystery is part of the point. But what the lore does make clear is that the process is not instant, that it has a cost, that it can be disrupted or complicated by sufficiently extreme circumstances, and that what comes out the other side is the same person in all the essential ways, but sometimes changed in ways that reflect what they went through. Vulcan, after the Fulgurite incident, was not the same as Vulcan before it. He was himself continuous, recognizably the Primarch of the Salamanders, with all of the values and the personality and the history that description implies. But the months of Kurz's torture and the specific action of the Fulgurite on his perpetual nature had changed things at the edges. His approach to certain kinds of situations, his understanding of his own limits and his own capabilities, the way he thought about death and what came after it, which he now had considerably more direct experience of than almost any being in the galaxy. The Ullanor event was more extreme than any previous death in his record. The absorption of the greenskin energy field was something unprecedented, not just in Vulcan's personal history, but in the documented history of what perpetuals have endured. The question is not whether he could survive it in principle, because the principle is established. The question is what the recovery looks like, how long it takes, and what comes out on the other side. There is a version of this that produces a Vulcan who wakes up in the ruins of Ullanor's Gorkograd, covered in cooling ash, with the vague awareness that something significant has happened, and the more immediate awareness that he needs to understand where he is and what condition he is in before he does anything else. He lies there for a while, which given his history of recovery times is not unusual. Then he stands up. Then he makes a decision about what to do next, based on whatever understanding of the current situation is available to him from the ruins of the battle. He might walk away from Ullanor immediately. He might stay in the ruins for a period, for reasons that would make sense to him even if they are not obvious to external observers. He might find his way to a position where he can observe what is happening in the wider galaxy without being observable himself, waiting for the right moment to be known again in a way that produces useful results rather than complicating a situation that might be better served by his absence from the visible record. This last possibility is not inconsistent with his character. Vulcan has always been the most patient of the Primarchs. His approach to problems is not always the immediate, visible, loud one. He knows how to wait. He knows how to let things develop until the moment when his intervention will produce the effect he wants. He has practiced this for 10,000 years, in the silence between his appearances and in the long space of his original disappearance. If he is alive and choosing not to be visible, the reasons might be as simple as the recognition that the conditions the Tome of Fire describes as the moment of his return are not yet fully met. 4 artifacts remain unfound. He said he would come back when the artifacts were all home. He meant it. He does not make promises he doesn't intend to keep. Supplemental section. What Vulcan's return would mean for the 41st millennium. The speculative but lore-grounded question of what Vulcan's actual return in the current era would mean for the 41st millennium setting is worth exploring, because it is not simply a feel-good conclusion to a long story, but a genuinely interesting, strategic, and narrative question. Guilliman's return transformed the Imperium in immediate and measurable ways. He brought with him the organizational competence and the political authority to force changes that had been resisted for centuries. He created the Primaris Space Marines, overhauling the foundational technology of the Adeptus Astartes in ways that will reverberate for generations. He launched the Indomitus Crusade, the largest imperial military operation since the Great Crusade itself. His return was transformative in the specific way that a very capable executive, returning from a long absence to a dysfunctional organization, tends to be transformative, which is to say loudly and with consequences for everyone involved. Vulcan's return would be different in character and also potentially different in timing. He would not return as a reorganizer or an executive. He would return as a warrior in the fullest sense, someone who fights not because he is commanded to, but because the people who need protecting are in front of him, and he is the person best positioned to protect them. He would return as a father to his sons, which is a relationship the salamanders have maintained across 10,000 years of absence, in a way that suggests the reunion would be one of the most emotionally significant events in the chapter's history. He would also return at the moment the Tome of Fire describes as the final war. Not a war, the final war. Whatever that means in terms of the specific enemies and the specific scale and the specific stakes, it implies a conflict that the salamanders would recognize as the one Vulcan's return was always meant for, the culmination of everything the chapter has been building toward across its 10,000-year history. Consider what he brings that is unique among the surviving Primarchs. Guilliman brings administrative and political capability. The Lion brings tactical brilliance and raw combat power. Both are extraordinarily valuable. But Vulcan brings something different, something that the current era's particular configuration of problems might need in ways that are not immediately obvious. He brings the specific quality of believing that the people you're fighting for matter individually, not as an aggregate or a political constituency or a strategic resource. He brings 10,000 years of practice at fighting for ordinary people against enemies who view those people as incidental. He brings the Promethean Creed, which is not just a chapter tradition but a fully developed philosophical framework for what it means to endure catastrophe and rebuild from it rather than being defined by it. He also brings something that no other Primarch currently active in the setting can claim in quite the same way: the demonstrated ability to absorb the worst thing available and come back from it as himself. Not unchanged, because nothing comes back unchanged from the fires it goes through, but continuous, recognizable. Still, the person who stood in the center of a village with 2 hammers and refused to hide. Still, the person who sat with his sons in the ash of the worst days of their existence and helped them rebuild rather than abandoning them to their grief. Still, the person who told Courland he would return in another time to help humanity face a conflict that would make them tremble. That last statement, made before the Ullanor explosion, is perhaps the most direct piece of evidence for his return that the lore provides outside of the perpetual biology itself. He was not saying farewell. He was issuing a forecast. He expected to be present for the conflict he was describing. He was describing, in the future tense, an event he intended to participate in. The conditions he specified for his return, all 9 artifacts home to Nocturne, were not fully met at the time of Ullanor. They are not fully met in the 41st millennium. But the gap between the current state, 5 artifacts recovered, and the complete state, 9 artifacts recovered, is not absolute. It is 4 artifacts. 4 objects that exist somewhere in the galaxy. Their locations hidden in passages of the Tome of Fire that have not yet yielded their final interpretation to the Forge Fathers, who have read them across the centuries. This is not an insuperable gap. It is a defined distance with a defined direction of travel. The Forge Father is searching. The tome is being read by people who are becoming, generation by generation, more capable of understanding what it is trying to tell them. The conditions are being worked toward, and somewhere in the galaxy, patient and enduring, and absolutely committed to the promise he made his sons, the Primarch of the Salamanders is waiting for the signal that will tell him the work is done. When it comes, the fires of Nocturne will light up. Mount Deathfire will speak in its own language of heat and light, and the deep geological rumble of something vast and patient making itself known. And the person who comes out of that process will be the one who was always coming, changed, as the circle of fire demands that everything which passes through it must be changed. But continuous, but himself. Supplemental section. Vulcan among his brothers. The relationships that defined him. Understanding Vulcan fully requires understanding him in relation to his brothers, because Primarchs are defined not just by their own character, but by how their character expresses itself in contact with the other extraordinary beings who share their nature and their purpose. His relationship with Ferrus Manus was the most productive of the ongoing arguments. Ferrus was everything that Vulcan was not in terms of philosophical disposition, immediate where Vulcan was patient, efficient where Vulcan was thorough, focused on outcomes in aggregate where Vulcan focused on outcomes for specific individuals. The two of them argued about almost everything related to how the Great Crusade should be conducted and what the Imperium being built was supposed to be for. And they conducted those arguments in genuine good faith, because they genuinely respected each other, because neither of them was simply wrong, and because the tension between their positions was real and productive, and generated better thinking from both of them than either would have done alone. Ferris died at Istvan 5 in the opening catastrophe of the Dropsite massacre, killed by Fulgrim in a moment that the lore treats as one of the most significant single deaths of the entire heresy. Vulcan lost his closest intellectual sparring partner in that moment, the person he had counted on to push back against his positions with the force of genuine competence and genuine opposition. That loss is not something the accounts dwell on extensively, because the immediate enormity of the massacre overwhelmed individual grief. But it was real, and it was part of what Vulcan was carrying when Kurz captured him, part of the weight that the torture process pressed against. His relationship with Fulgrim was something the lore treats with a particular kind of sadness, because Fulgrim before his fall was one of the Primarchs who genuinely liked Vulcan. He called Vulcan the most trustworthy of the Primarchs, meaning it as a genuine assessment rather than flattery. The contrast between that pre-fall Fulgrim, who could recognize and appreciate Vulcan's particular quality of keeping his word and meaning what he said, and the Daemon Prince, who ended Ferrus Manus's life with the weapon that Vulcan himself had made, is one of the heresy's most effectively painful ironies. The Salamander's Forge Lord made the blade that killed his closest friend. He did not know that when he made it. He could not have known. His relationship with his father, the Emperor, is one that the lore handles with some delicacy, because the Emperor's relationship with all of his sons is complicated by the question of how much the father genuinely loved the sons versus how completely he viewed them as instruments of his purposes. Vulcan's specific relationship with the Emperor began with the contest on Nocturne, a competition that the Emperor chose to conduct rather than simply revealing himself, which suggests either that the Emperor wanted to see what Vulcan was before collecting him, or that he wanted Vulcan to experience the collection as something won rather than something given. Either interpretation is consistent with what we know about the Emperor's general approach to his sons. What the lore does suggest is that Vulcan was the Primarch the Emperor trusted most completely with the human side of the Great Crusade's mission, not the military side, not the administrative side, the side that was about what kind of relationship the Imperium would have with the people who lived in it. Vulcan was the one the Emperor pointed at worlds where the transition to imperial authority needed to be done with particular care for the existing population. He was the one whose judgment about how to handle delicate situations the Emperor apparently trusted above most of his other sons. Whether that trust was part of what made Vulcan's loss during the heresy so damaging to the Emperor's larger project, and whether the current era's return of Primarchs is partly an attempt to recover capacities that were lost when the loyalist Primarchs disappeared one by one, is a question the lore raises without answering directly. But the structural argument for Vulcan's importance in the restored Imperium is not difficult to make. His relationship with Conrad Kurz deserves more consideration than it usually gets, because Kurz's obsession with Vulcan was not random. The Night Haunter chose to invest enormous time and effort in the specific project of breaking Vulcan precisely because he believed Vulcan was the most fundamentally opposed version of what Kurz himself was. Not the most militarily dangerous, though Vulcan was certainly dangerous in that sense. The most philosophically dangerous, the one whose existence most directly challenged the argument. Kurz had been making his entire life about the nature of violence and the relationship between fear and control, and the inevitability of darkness in the hearts of even the best people. Kurz needed Vulcan to break, because Vulcan's refusal to break was a standing refutation of everything Kurz believed was true about what was underneath the nobility that beings like Vulcan performed. If Vulcan could be shown to be, at the core, the same kind of being that Kurz was, then Kurz's philosophy was vindicated, and his life made sense in a way it otherwise couldn't. If Vulcan couldn't be broken, if the compassion and the protection of innocence held through every extremity that Kurz could apply, then Kurz had to face the possibility that he was wrong. And Kurz couldn't bear being wrong about this, because if he was wrong about this, then everything he had done in Nostromo, and to his own legion, was simply wrong, with no philosophical cover available. Vulcan didn't break. He held the line through everything. And in doing so, he proved something that the Salamanders have been living by ever since, that the commitment to protecting people is not a performance of nobility that breaks under sufficient pressure. It is a fundamental orientation that, when it is genuinely held rather than merely performed, holds precisely because the pressure would have to take everything for the commitment to fail, and for Vulcan, there was always something left. His relationship with Guilliman in the post-heresy period and the War of the Beast period is illuminating in a different way. Guilliman represented the administrative and intellectual side of what the Imperium needed to become after the heresy. He was the one who thought in systems and structures and long-term institutional design. Vulcan represented the relational and protective side, the one who thought in specific people and specific outcomes and the immediate, present-tense reality of what was happening to the human beings affected by the decisions being made. The two approaches are complementary rather than competing. An Imperium that has only Guilliman's administrative competence without Vulcan's grounding in specific human reality tends, over time, to become an efficient machine for producing outcomes that nobody living inside it actually wanted. An Imperium that has only Vulcan's protective instinct without Guilliman's organizational capability tends to be wonderful in individual interactions and catastrophic at scale. The presence of both, the combination of the two orientations operating in concert, is what the Emperor's original vision seems to have been moving toward before the heresy interrupted it. Watching Vulcan operate during the War of the Beast, particularly in his interactions with Courland, you can see what this combination looks like in practice. He deferred to Courland on matters of coordination and political management, not because he lacked the authority to override, but because he recognized that Courland was better positioned to manage those relationships, and that his own energy was better applied to the problem he was uniquely capable of solving. He was the person who could walk into the Beast's Temple Gargant alone and come back from what happened there. There was no one else who could do that. He knew it and acted accordingly. This is not ego or status. It is the craftsman's understanding of which tool is right for which job, applied to the problem of how to allocate the specific capabilities available in a crisis. Guilliman, similarly, when he returned in the era Indomitus, directed his efforts toward what he was uniquely positioned to do, which was reorganize the Imperium's administrative infrastructure. The two Primarchs, operating in their respective spheres, would cover a much larger range of what the Imperium needs than either one could cover alone. The era that seems to be building toward in the 41st millennium, with the Great Rift and the escalating existential pressure and the return of loyalist Primarchs, looks structurally like the configuration the Emperor was originally trying to create. Not identical, because 10,000 years of damage and change have made identical impossible, but analogous, in the way that something rebuilt from the same principles by skilled hands using available materials resembles the original design, even when the specific materials and conditions are different. The Circle of Fire applies at civilizational scale as much as at individual scale. The Imperium has been through the fire many times since the heresy. Each passage through the fire has changed it. What is being assembled now, with Primarchs returning and Crusades launching, and the fundamental assumptions of the setting being challenged and renegotiated in ways they weren't before, is something that is not the pre-heresy Imperium, and is not the 10,000-year status quo. It is something new, built from the ash of what was destroyed and the principles that survived the destruction. That something new needs what Vulcan has to offer. It needs the person who fights for specific individuals rather than abstract populations. It needs the person who understands that the protection of the ordinary human being is not a side effect of victory, but the purpose of it. It needs the Primarch who stood in the center of a burning village with two hammers and chose to endure rather than hide. The Tome of Fire is being read, the artifacts are being found, the conditions are being assembled, and somewhere in the vast dark between the stars, patient and enduring and fully committed to the promise he made his sons, a fire that has not yet found the fuel it needs to blaze, is waiting for the moment when everything that needs to be ready is ready. That moment is closer now than it has ever been. That fire will not stay banked forever, and when it speaks, it will announce itself in the only language it has ever known, in the present tense, without qualification, without apology, without any possibility of being mistaken for a metaphor. Vulcan lives.